So my name is John Flanders. I work for a company called MCW Technologies. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I do a lot of work with Microsoft as a vendor. I've talked at the last, a large number of the last 10 tech eds, both here in the United States and across the world. And we're here today to talk about how to apply branding to a SharePoint 2010 website. Okay? So what is this all about? Okay? The idea is, sorry, let me go back one slide. SharePoint 2010 and earlier versions of SharePoint as well have what they typically refer to from Microsoft as workloads, right? We can do a lot of different workloads with SharePoint. One workload is document management, team sites, and that's kind of what people think about when they talk about SharePoint. They talk about, oh, well, we use SharePoint for creating an intranet site, for adding documents, for sharing documents, for being able to show, internal data. And that's great. SharePoint is awesome at that. One of the other things that SharePoint is awesome at is web content management. That is, having a framework so that people who are creating websites and website content can go to SharePoint. They can use familiar tools because they're probably already using SharePoint on the intranet, and they can add content to public websites. There are a number of public websites that run on SharePoint. Ferrari.com is one famous one. Hawaiian Airlines is another one. Recovery.gov, for those of you that are from the US, the stimulus package, all that money, recovery.gov lets you see where that money has been spent and gone, and the whole recovery.gov site is built on top of SharePoint. So people don't generally think of public websites when they think of SharePoint, but SharePoint does support that workflow through its web content management features. Now, one of the problems that people have had with sort of convincing people that SharePoint can do that workload is branding. That is, how do we make a SharePoint site not look like a SharePoint site? How do we make a SharePoint site look like a public website, a highly designed, pixel-perfect kind of website that uses, CSS and jQuery and all the newfangled things? And a lot of people think, oh, well, that's not, it's very hard. I don't know how Hawaiian Airlines is doing it. I don't know how Ferrari.com is doing it, but people kind of think of that as being very difficult. What I'm going to show you, hopefully in the next 75 minutes, is that it's not as difficult as you think, and I'm going to go through the steps to sort of create a proof of concept SharePoint site that is branded, okay? A lot of this idea here is if you're trying to sell SharePoint to a customer, if you're a Microsoft partner, or if you're internal Microsoft consultant, or if you're trying to sell the idea of SharePoint for this purpose to your company, if you work for a company, what's nice to be able to do is to take one or two pages from a website, from your website or from some website that's highly designed that's similar to your website or in your industry, and sort of put together a proof of concept. That's the idea behind this particular session, is to give you the information and hopefully skills that you need in order to be able to do that. Whoops, that's reverse. F for forward. Now, what do you need? Well, obviously you need people who understand some parts of SharePoint 2010. You need to understand master pages, page layouts, and the web content management features and capabilities. You're also going to need somebody who can do web design, so somebody who knows HTML, JavaScript, potentially XSLT, depending on what you're using inside of SharePoint. Also, you're going to need somebody who understands ASP.NET and also image or Photoshop skills, expression, etc. Now, this might be one person, right? You might have one person that has all these skills. You might have 2 people, you might have 3 people, you might have 4 people, right? It depends on your team, right? But in order to successfully sort of build a highly customizable, pixel-perfect SharePoint website, you're going to need these skills. Now, by the way, just sort of go on an off-topic thing for a second. They came up to me beforehand and said, you didn't upload your slides, they're not on ComNet. And I said, I did upload my slides, but I guess your tool didn't take them or whatever. So they have a copy of my slides. They're going to scrub them and then put them up on ComNet. So you will have these slides even though they're not on ComNet right now. I will also post my code on my blog. So if you go to your favorite search engine and type in John Flanders blog, you should find my blog. I'm the technical guy. If you type in John Flanders blog, you're going to actually find two blogs. One is my technical blog. It usually comes up first. But there's a guy who lives in Vermont or New Hampshire who's a communist. And he also has a blog. So, regardless of my political leanings, no, I'm not a communist. So that's not me. Plus, he's, a little bit older, so you should be able to tell, right? Older gentleman, fine looking, but I'm sure the communism helps him there. Okay. So what are we going to build? Well, we're going to build a website. So you have to pick what website you're going to build. Now, sometimes you are building something from a sort of an HTML template that maybe a designer gave you, which is what I'm actually going to do in this session. I'm going to do a pretend website of a company called Blue Yonder Airlines. Why am I doing a pretend website instead of doing, some real website? This website, in essence, is a real website because it's a designed website. It was designed by a person who designs lots of websites. It was used in a number of demos over the last year and a half. So the website actually is real. It just isn't, a public website. And the reason we're not using somebody's quote-unquote real website is because Microsoft is, extremely sensitive about violating other people's copyright. And so if I went to, pick a website. If I went to, oracle.com and redid oracle.com inside of SharePoint, inside of this session, and then that got broadcasted on TechEd Live, the Microsoft lawyers would be very unhappy. So this is, not a real website, quote unquote, but when me and my partners built it, we did build it, as a real website. That is, it has real functionality, it was highly designed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you're trying to convince a customer or your company that your website or their website should be in SharePoint, what you want to do is look at their website and pick a couple of pages to build. Generally the home page, and maybe one or other two pages in, oftentimes you can look at a website and break it down into what I typically call content buckets. So, things like, about the company, products, or, contact, a few of those buckets, pick a few of those pages and build a few of them. But try to keep it simple, right? Don't try to recreate the whole site, again, as part of the proof of concept. All right, this is the picture of Blue Yonder. Now I'm going to switch over to my laptop where I'm going to do my demo. And I probably will stay over here the rest of the time doing demo. I'll see how much I can get done in the time that I have left. What do I have left now? Like almost 60, 65 minutes? And if we have time at the end, then I'll go back, finish up the slides, and hopefully at the end we'll have time for questions as well, for you guys to have questions. If you want to ask a question that's pertinent in the context of the session, I'm happy to answer it. If it's not pertinent to the context, I might ask you to come back and ask it at the end. All right, so this is the website, Blue Yonder Airlines. What do we have? We've got a logo, we've got some navigation, we've got an image here, which is sort of the main header of the front page. We've got some buttons to check in and retrieve booking, and we've got some little footer items here that are sort of like promotional footer items, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do, before I dissect this web page any further to figure out how we're going to make SharePoint look like that, the first thing I'm going to do is create a web application, right? So I'm going to go to the SharePoint Central Admin, and I'm going to say New Web Application. Please wait while the content loads. Now there's going to be Nothing really special about the web application if I want to create it as a public website, although, and we're not going to cover this in this session, but you probably want to select that you want to do claims-based authorization. Claims-based authorization allows you to do things like do forms-based auth or federated security. I think in the keynote they talked about the access control service, and they showed that toolkit for Windows Phone, right, where they said, hey, sign in with Google or Facebook or Yahoo or Live ID. That's an example of federated identity, and SharePoint integrates well with that in 2010, but you need to pick claims mode. So I'll click claims mode, even though we won't do security in here. I can specify the name of a site and a port and a host header. In this case, I'm okay with 7241. Seems like a good port to me. I'm going to say allow anonymous, yes, because some parts of my site may be authenticated, but some parts of my site, if I'm a public website, might be anonymous. So I'm going to check that here. Right now, I'm just going to enable Windows authentication. If I want to enable forms-based authentication later, I can come back in and check that. If I'm doing a federated security, I can come back later and pick what's called a trusted identity provider. For example, the access control service they talked about today in the keynote would be an example of a trusted identity provider, Windows Live. So there's a number of them out there. I'm going to go ahead and leave the default sign-in page. There's my default URL. I'm going to pick who this is going to run as. I'm going to go with all the other defaults and press OK. The reason I'm going to do that now and then switch back is that that's going to take a couple seconds. Right, what SharePoint is doing, it's going out and provisioning a new web application inside of IIS. It's creating a new app pool, setting up this web application to have sites inside of it, right, which is what we're going to want. So while that's working, let's go over here and look at the HTML. So the first thing I'm going to do in terms of the HTML is to try to figure out what in this HTML page is going to go into my master page and what's going to go inside of individual pages. In a SharePoint Web Content Management solution, those individual pages are going to be what are called page layouts, okay? But they're really just ASP.NET pages that are the body of the site. So this is one of the things that you need to do is to go in and sort of hunt and peck around and figure out, what HTML do I want to be in the master page and what HTML do I want to be in the body. Now, if I just look at the rendered HTML, I have a pretty good idea, right? I have a pretty good idea that, everything up here in this section is going to be in the master page, right? Because that's my logo and my navigation. I'm figuring that the stuff down here at the bottom, right? These little boxes of content, those are going to be part of my master page. And then the data in here is going to be part of the home page, part of the page layout that will end up being my home page. So I'm going to need to figure out, which part of the HTML is attached to which rendering. Now, I can go through over here. I've got this website up in a, this is just a file system website, so there's no ASP.NET or anything like that. It's just raw HTML, CSS, images, etc. I'm glad my device is ready to use. I don't know what device that is, but hopefully I need it. So this HTML is not that complicated, right? And so from that point of view, this is maybe not as real an example as something like a Microsoft.com homepage. How would you figure out, in a very complex site, what goes in the master page and what goes in the page layout? A tool that you want to know and love in IE is the IE developer tools. If you haven't ever used them before, use them today, use them every day. They are awesome. People refer to them as the F12 tools because if you want to get them up, you can just click F12. I like when I have enough room on my monitor to put them side by side to snap the two windows on either side. There is just a boatload of functionality in these F12 tools that will make building any kind of website, but in some ways, especially a SharePoint website, much, much easier, okay? What are some of these tools? Well, I have a CSS tab. The CSS tab shows me what are all the CSS pages that are loaded, CSS files, cascading style sheet files. Here I have a console where I can see errors or actually type in interactive script. here is my script tag, and if I want to start debugging, I can just click on Start Debugging. Yeah, Visual Studio has great debugging for web pages now in JavaScript. But sometimes, if you're pulling it from a SharePoint site, IE is not going to really help you. It's nice to just be able to drop right inside of IE and say, I want to start debugging. Profiler will tell you how long things are going to load, how long things are taking to load. And one of my favorite ones is this is new for IE9. It's not on the IE8 toolbar, which is just another good reason to upgrade to IE9, is network. And if I do network and say start capturing, what this is going to do is it's going to basically show me what are all the resources that this web page is asking for, right? When is this really useful? Well, this is really useful when you're trying to recreate this page, which is what I'm going to do, and for some reason something's not loading or something doesn't look right. One of the easiest way to figure out what's not loading is to go to this tab, and if something can't be found, what you're going to see is you're going to see a 404, you're going to see a red line, and that'll tell you immediately what's not being loaded, and that makes that sort of debugging that much easier. There's another great tool out there for doing that called Fiddler, which I love Fiddler too, especially for web services calls. But inside of IE, like I said, when I'm doing websites, I almost always have this open all the time, and so it's already open, it's already right there. And it also works with SSL, so if you've got a website that's using SSL, this actually shows you, what's happening in the browser. Fiddler, you can make it do SSL network sniffing, but it's kind of a pain, okay? So we're going to use this a lot, all right. So let's switch gears for a second, and I'm doing this a little bit asynchronously because we have to wait for SharePoint to do some stuff, and so we want to come back. So let's leave the web page alone for a second, come back to SharePoint. Application is created. Great, I've got a web application. What I need now inside of that web application is a site collection. Site collection is, a site and all of its subsites, and they will share a number of common pieces of infrastructure, including a content database. So I'm going to create a site collection. I'm going to call it Blue Yonder Airlines. I'm just going to create it at the root. Now this is the important thing for purposes of doing web content management, is that you want to go, when you're creating the site collection, and pick one of the publishing templates. The publishing templates have all of the web content management features enabled. Now, you don't have to do that. You could pick your own template or pick a blank template and then go in and individually enable all the web content management features. But it's generally a better place to start with something that has something in it already, which this template does. Now notice that there are two templates here. One is Publishing Portal and one is Enterprise Wiki. The only difference is which master page gets applied, basically, the look and feel of the site. The Enterprise Wiki looks more like a SharePoint team site, and that's why I like to pick the Publishing Portal, because it actually does have a design applied to it. But either one of those templates will work. I'm going to go ahead and specify the administrator is me, and I'm going to press OK. So that's going to go out, and that's going to create a site collection, including a top-level site that's going to use the Publishing Portal template. Okay? So let's let SharePoint do its thinking and working in the background while I switch back over. Okay? Now, back over here in the IE tools, again, we're switching gears here a little bit. I said one of the things that this tool can help you is to figure out what HTML represents the HTML you want to go into the master page, and what HTML you want to go into individual page layouts. One of the best parts of this tool is this little select by element icon. So if you click that and then you go over here, notice that the image that I'm hovering over has a blue outline, right? Does everybody see the blue outline? I think if I zoom in with zoom it, yeah, so you can still see the blue outline, right? And so as I just hover through the page, notice that different elements are turning blue, right? Let me go back and select this again. And if I click on one of them, notice over here, it brings me right to that HTML that represents that element, okay? So I click on the click by element button. I go hover over the page until I find the blue outline of the element that I'm interested in. Then I click, and then it shows me the HTML, right? So how does this make this easy? Well, it's pretty easy to say, okay, if I click here, well, I know that the header, right, that's going to be part of the master page, right? If I go hover over down here, I can click that, and then click, oh, well, that's in the footer ads, right? And so if I highlight that, right, I can see that content, and then the middle strip, and then the header content, these two pieces of HTML, and notice as I select them over here, IE is highlighting them. Those are the things that are going to the main page. So even when you have a site that has much more complicated HTML than this, figuring out which element in the page represents stuff that you want to go into the header and the footer, so into the master page, and stuff that you want to have go into the body of the page is pretty easy to do, okay? So we're going to use that in a minute to figure out and copy the HTML that we want to have be in those different pieces of infrastructure. Let's go over and see where SharePoint is with my task that I gave it. Great. New top-level site was created. I click on the hyperlink, and this brings me to this site, okay? So this site that's coming up on the screen is a SharePoint site. It's newly created, right? I created it blank from a blank template, or not a blank template, but a template that's included with the SharePoint product itself, so there's nothing up my sleeves, right? I didn't create something that I had pre-populated with a bunch of stuff before. This is essentially a blank template. Now, it is kind of weird that it says AdventureWorks, right? That's kind of weird, but they had to pick something, so they had to pick something they own, so it says AdventureWorks. But it's a WCM site. It's a site that can be customized by modifying the master page or adding a new master page, which is typically what you're going to want to do. And then you're going to be able to do all sorts of stuff with it in terms of creating pages where users can go in and add content. And so this is what we're going to start with. Okay. So the question is, how do we go about getting a master page into this site? Right? First, we have to get a master page in. Then we have to start adding our HTML to that master page. Now, as I said, you can start with the master page that's included with this site. And this is where we go to the tool that, some people love and some people hate. Ted Pattison, do you love or hate SharePoint Designer?
I love it.
Go on record. Ted Pattison, SharePoint guru, loves SharePoint Designer. This is the tool actually used to be called Front Page, which is why they changed the name a few years ago, because everybody hated Front Page, right? So they changed it to SharePoint Designer. It's better. It still does some kind of weird things in places. The only downside for me in terms of SharePoint Designer, and this is just me as a developer, and I'll actually show you in a second some of the ways that I get around this, is that I like to be able to check things into source control. Anything I do in the SharePoint Designer, anything I do in the web UI is part of the site definition, and that's not very easy for me to package up and put in my source control system so that other people on my team can download stuff and deploy it. And so there's a number of ways to work around that, but that's my biggest problem. Let's go to master pages. The master page that's applied to the site by default is called the night and day master. And again, I typically don't want to modify that master because I want to be able to have that one as one to look at and sort of lean back to. So what I want to do is I want to create a new master page. Now, here's something to hate about SharePoint Designer. There's this button here that says blank master page. It's very tempting, right? It's, I said the first thing we're going to want to do is to create a new master page. Blank master page, that seems like a good button to click on, right? Let's see what happens when I click on it. It's going to create me a new master page. So let me give it a new name. Blue Yonder Master. Okay. It's adding it to my site. If I right-click, I can say set as custom master page. The custom master page is the one that applies to the designed part of the website, so like this page. On the other hand, if I go to site actions and site settings, that takes me to sort of an administrative page, not a customer-facing page. And so that has sort of the default master page look and feel of SharePoint on it. You can customize this one as well if you want, and you can have the same master page apply to both. But more often than not, we're just concerned about the custom master page. So I'm going to go say set as custom master page. And let's go back and refresh. Great. An unexpected error has occurred. 11F5D862. Very, very helpful. I could use this information. I can go look at the SharePoint logs. And what it's going to tell me is that one of the content areas that is necessary by some part of SharePoint isn't defined in my master page. Why the blank master page doesn't start out with everything you need? Don't know. So if you go look at articles and blog posts, what do people tell you to do? Here's what people tell you to do. Create a blank master page, go to edit it, we can go to code mode, and basically delete everything from it, okay? Go and find a starter master page. There's a number of starter master pages. The one I'm going to use is a starter master page that was built by a Microsoft MVP named Randy Driscoll, who does a lot of work in this area, and Tekka Demos. And I've got a starter master page. I'm going to open it up with my favorite editor, Visual Studio 2010, and I'm going to copy and paste. Right? I'm going to select all. I'm going to copy. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to paste, and then I'm going to save. This is what I describe, if you're an ASP.NET developer and you're used to ASP.NET master pages, when you create your own master page, typically it's basically a top-down design. That is, you're deciding what all the content areas are in the page that need to be defined. When you're doing it in SharePoint, it's sort of reverse. SharePoint has a number of content areas content placeholders that it expects you to replace it has a bunch of content placeholders that different parts of the system sort of expect. And if you don't have all of those, then you'll get 11B4D6 or your favorite GUID, right? That is the error that you can actually go figure it out, but it's much easier to start with this. Okay, so now if I save this, I can go back to the site, and if I refresh, I should have something that's a little bit more palatable, okay? And the nice thing about Randy's master page is that not only does it have all the right content placeholders so you don't get the error, it also is very well documented. So he's added, if you look at it, HTML, actually looking at it in Visual Studio might be easier, HTML comments for all the different areas, right? So this is the top section of the left navigation bar, right? And if we scroll up and scroll down, here is the ribbon, right, which is the big editing thing. So it's very nice to start with something like this because it's complete, it's well documented, and it's a great starting place. Now, so don't ever do that whole blank master page, right, and copy and paste in front of a customer. I feel when I first did that, right, and I just felt like something was wrong, right? It just didn't feel right. So as I said before, one of the things that I like to do is I like to bring all my SharePoint artifacts into Visual Studio. The reason that I like to bring them into Visual Studio, even those artifacts that are not developer artifacts, right, that aren't, C# or VB.NET code, is because the SharePoint project system in Visual Studio does a bunch of work for me in terms of creating something that I can package up later and actually deploy, right? Creating a SharePoint site and changing the master page and adding page layouts and all the stuff that we're going to do, great. But how do I get that off of my machine and onto somebody else's machine, right? If I'm working with Ted, how do I get him to be able to see the same site that I've just created? If I'm moving from my dev environment to my test environment, how do I package that up? And the way to package up artifacts in SharePoint is to put them in what's called a WSP. That's a SharePoint package. And then you can take those packages and deploy them. Visual Studio in 2010 has support for these packages. Unfortunately, they didn't add templates for things like master pages. Luckily, however, again, that system is very extensible. So what I've done is I've created a project template with with that starter master page. And so when I go, new project, it's going to create a map folder for me that's going to map to the master pages folder. And inside of here is the master page, the template master page. Now, the downside of this is I don't get all the designer help of SharePoint Designer, right? I don't get, drag and drop. I don't get, click on web parts and see web part properties. So typically what I do is I do, whatever I need to in that area in SharePoint Designer, then I copy my master page over here, and then I have what's called a feature receiver. And so my feature receiver, what I have is basically code that deploys the master page as the custom master, right? So what this allows me to do is, instead of doing that whole, what are the steps that I did, right? Create a new master page, delete all the content, copy the starter master page, paste it, save it, set it as the custom master page. I can do that all with one swoop in Visual Studio. So let me go back and set this as the custom master page again. Night and day master. That's the HTML. Okay, so there's the site. If I go over to Visual Studio, I need to specify this URL as the URL that I'm going to deploy to. I do that in the project properties. Right? Right-click and say deploy. And what this is going to do is this is going to add the master page, set it as the custom master, and then basically set up my environment the way I need it to be to start working. The downside of this approach that I'm showing you is if I do anything in SharePoint Designer or in the web UI, I have to take those things and move them over to Visual Studio. I have found it to be worth the trouble, even in the proof of concepts that I've done and the projects, small projects that I've done, because what that means is if I keep everything in Visual Studio inside of projects that can be deployed, I can start from scratch, right? I can start from a blank SharePoint site, I can do a deployment in Visual Studio, and I can be at the stage I need to be to start developing. I can also check it all into source control, which is important. More importantly, anybody else in my team can check out the solution from source control, on their local machine, recreate the SharePoint site with everything that I've done, and also start developing, right? So it's almost like, a real developer cycle. Okay, deployed succeeded. Let's go back over here. That's the HTML. Here we go. Refresh. So there we go, right? It's the same starter master page, but I didn't have to do any of that copy and paste garbage. They told me beforehand that everything, this is going to be recorded and replayed, right? So they're like, well, you should be careful about what you say. And so that, of course, for me is just tempting, right, to say more things. That's really broken, right? People from Microsoft who are watching, that whole thing I have to do where a blank master page doesn't work and then I have to cut it all and then I copy and paste from a template, that's broken. Fix that, okay? This is one way around it, right? And you can establish your own, ways of dealing with it. Some people like to just, have PowerShell scripts that do it. Doesn't matter, but you should have some process around, even when you're doing sort of a proof of concept. Okay, let's get to the meat of this. So what I want to do is I want to start to take the HTML that's in the the designed HTML and start applying it over here to my SharePoint site. So what I need is I need all of my artifacts. Let's go over here to this site. What I need is I need all the artifacts that my designer has put into this designed website. So the CSS files, right? I'm going to need the CSS files. I'm going to need all of the images. I'm going to need the JavaScript, okay? So where we put those inside of WCM site in SharePoint is a place called the Style Library. It's built specifically for that kind of thing. And over here in my Visual Studio solution, I actually also have a style library mapped path. So the style library map path allows me to take things that are in my project and actually deploy them and put them in a library inside of SharePoint. In this case, I'm saying I want to put some stuff in the style library. Okay? To save a little bit of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this folder in Windows Explorer. I'm going to go over here, and I've got all of the images and CSS and everything that I need already put into a folder where I have modified the, except I don't want to copy that, right? I don't want to copy the SharePoint data file. I want to copy everything else. If I refresh, oh, I need to say add existing item. I don't need to add that. I don't need to add that. Don't need to add that. Okay. So all I'm doing is just a copy and paste so that, you don't have to watch me type in and fix, and do all these things inside of the XML file inside of Visual Studio. Okay. So this basically will set up my style library. This will put all of the images that I'm going to need. It'll put the CSS that I need, everything in my style library. Now it's all, again, neatly packaged into my SharePoint project in Visual Studio, and I can deploy it. Now, I could do that from SharePoint Designer. I could do it from the web UI. Again, I like to do it this way because I like having the project at the end. One of the other things that the Visual Studio Project System can do for you, regardless if you write a line of code, for those of you that don't write code, don't be worried, because if I can right-click here and say package, what this is going to actually do is create the WSP. And if I open up the folder, I go to bin debug, right? There's my WSP. This is the thing that I can take and deploy to my test environment, to my production environment. And because I can add event receivers, I can essentially script and package up my whole SharePoint site in one or more WSPs, right? So again, even when you're starting out early on, if you can automate as much of this as possible, you're going to be happier, because that means, for example, I've had 2 scenarios in the last month where it has just totally saved my butt. One scenario was I was teaching a class, and for some reason my machine just went sort of pear-shaped, and everything sort of blew up, and I basically had to repave my machine. And when I repaved my machine, I reinstalled SharePoint, and I went to Visual Studio, and I said deploy, and I had back to the point of where I had left off, right? It saved me. Another scenario was I was building a proof of concept like this for Microsoft, and when we went to the customer, I was planning on running the site off my laptop, and the guy I was working with from Microsoft said, no, I'd really like to run it off my laptop, and it's Windows Server, and yours is Windows 7. And so I was able to just take the Visual Studio projects, take the WSPs, take them over to that machine, deploy them, and there it was. The site was set up. So it wasn't hours and hours of going and poking around inside of SharePoint for, oh yeah, what did I do on that site? Oh yeah, I clicked that button. And where did I put that file? Oh yeah, I put that file over there. Which I've done before too. It's just painful to recreate, right? Okay. So back over here. Finally, now we're to the master page. Now, what is the first thing I'm going to need in a master page for my site? The first thing I'm going to need is I'm going to need my CSS, right? We go down here. Here is a CSS control that's built into SharePoint. This is how you're going to want to add your CSS to your page in SharePoint. The reason you want to use this is there's a special property on this CSS registration control called after. And it says after, in this case, core v4.css, which is the main SharePoint CSS file. SharePoint in 2010 relies heavily on CSS for layout. In 2007, there was a lot more things that relied on tables for layout. So keeping with the times, as web developers have moved from using tables for layout to using and embracing CSS for layout, SharePoint went along with them. The issue is when you're building a highly designed type site on top of SharePoint, the SharePoint creators may have made some decisions in their CSS that you don't agree with, right? Which luckily CSS lets us handle. The way CSS lets us handle that is if we have our CSS load after this CSS, we can basically override and change any of the style properties that they've selected inside of their CSS. And so that's why this particular control is so important, is because it controls the order that the CSS is loaded. And we can specify that we want ours to load after the built-in one. I actually want to replace this with a little doohickey. And you know what? I can never remember what that is. Actually, you know what? I've got it over here. Ha. Copy and pasting is always so much better, isn't it? This is my after one. Okay, that'll save me a little time. Okay, so the little doohickey thing, the little replaceable text that I'm putting in there is SPURL, site collection, style library, blue yonder, default.css, layout.css, blue yonder.css. That just is basically a replaceable token that SharePoint knows about so that the URL will always be correct depending on where you are in the site collection hierarchy. Okay, so there's my CSS. I've got my CSS. And now it's time to go down and sort of figure out what's going to go into the body. Okay? One of the things that's inside of every SharePoint site is this ribbon. And people, again, kind of like SharePoint Designer, either love the ribbon or hate the ribbon. Regardless of whether you love or hate the ribbon is extremely useful if you are editing a page in the site, and it's mostly useless if you're an end user. If you're somebody who's just coming in to look at a page, you don't really care about the ribbon. There's a number of different ways to get rid of the ribbon in a WCM site. The two main ways that people use are to wrap it in a special SharePoint control that's security trimmed. So only if you have the right security privileges will the ribbon show up. The other way to do it is, and I like this other way better, is to say it only shows up if you're actually in edit mode, right? So, of course, you have to have the permissions to do that, to get into edit mode. So it's sort of, a subset of the other one. But that means if I want to look at the page as it's designed without the ribbon, I don't have to see the ribbon unless I want to see the ribbon, okay? So in order to do that, I need to bring in a namespace here. Oh, and I lost all that text in my toolbox. Cool. So let's do the next best thing. And copy and paste inheritance. So I need this register for that control, which is the edit mode panel. Right? And then what I can do is go down here to the ribbon and say SharePoint, what did I call that? Publishing web controls. Edit mode panel, run at equals to server, right? And then I can take this and go down, and because Randy was so kind as to say begin ribbon in ribbon, I don't even have to bother with all that. I can just say down here, okay? All right, so that gets rid of the ribbon, okay, for now. That's good, okay? Now we need to figure out how to get our HTML into this page, right? Which, should be fairly easy. All we have to do is kind of scroll down and look at the page and say, okay, there's a menu, there's a status area, here's the quick launch, here's content placeholder for that. Now, at the end, what you're going to end up doing is, in many cases, wanting to get rid of some of this content. As you saw from my blank master page demo, just removing things from the master page is probably a bad idea because some part of SharePoint is going to expect that a certain control is there, and if you take it out, it's not going to be happy. Luckily, ASP.NET has a great property that's available on every single ASP.NET control, which is visible equals to false, right? So the way to get rid of content that's part of the SharePoint system that you don't want to display in the page is just to say visible equals to false. Now, you can go back and sort of fine-grain tune some things, and there are things you can remove. But to start out with, I just find this much easier. And it also means that if I decide I want to use, for example, the portable sitemap data source, which actually doesn't render anything, so how about we do the ASP menu. I can add it back in very easily. Okay, so keep going down. Here's another menu. Let's set that visible equals to false. Quick launch, visible equals to false. Global site links, visible equals to false. Visible equals to false. Description, nah. Placeholder main. Placeholder main. Placeholder main is where the main content area is going to be, right? So what does this mean? Now I'm down at the point of the HTML where the body of a page is going to be loaded. So that means I can go in and start adding my HTML here, right? Everything I want to have be in the header, right, can go there. Everything I want to be in the footer can go here, right? So I can start adding stuff. All right, so let me start adding stuff. Let's go back over to the HTML here that I have and figure out what's going to go in the header. Well, if you remember back from my IE debugging session, right, we kind of went down and we found that this header content and this middle strip, both of these were content that was going to go into the page, right? This was content that was per page, actually specifically for the home page, not for every single page. So anything specific for one page is going to go into the page layout. Everything that's for all pages is going to go into the master page. So I'm going to go down from body, grab this thing called the shadow container, header, nav, go down here. Okay? That's all going to go, above the main page content. And if I go back over here, I can go down here, and here's that footer add section. Footer, div, body. I can go down here, right, and add it in there. All right? Now, notice that there's some image links here. The image links have obviously changed, right, because the images are now in my style library. So the best way to deal with that is to use that same syntax that I showed you with the CSS. Let's go back up here. This SP site collection style library blue yonder, right? Because I've put all of my artifacts inside of that particular folder inside of the site library. So let me go down here and do this quickly. I do have to do one other thing to make that syntax work, which is, this is going to be add, right? This is going to be this, and that's going to be that. The one thing I have to do is I have to make my image run at equals server, right? This is where it's ASP.NET, right? This is ASP.NET. I can add run at equals server to any control, and that makes it a server-side control, and that means it's going to do that replacement syntax for me. You have a question? The footer I'm adding below the main content placeholder, right? So the part of the master page is all the Chrome around the main body, right? And this is where SharePoint plops the main body, right? So I'm going to add my header above that and my footer below that. That make sense? All right. That was a weird copy and paste there. How about if we just do this? That's add 2. This is add 3. So for completeness, add 2, add 3. All right. Extra quote there for some reason. Weird. All right. Let's try it. How do I try it? I can just right-click and say deploy. My Visual Studio project's going to upload the file. It's going to set that file as the master page. It's going to upload every artifact that I've added. So, basically it's setting up the environment for me. This is what I was talking about before. Deploy succeeded. That's good. Let's go see what that looks like. This was the site before. Let's see what it looks like after. Yeah. Not perfect, right? But we're getting there, right? We're getting there. There's a couple of problems I'm having here. One is that I can't really, notice I can't scroll down in the page, okay? That's sort of a problem. Notice that the search box is still there. So how do I start debugging this? Again, F12 is your friend here, and my friend today. So I'm going to go to the F12 Developer Tools. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say, what is that? Oh, here's this placeholder search area, right? Let's see. Placeholder search area, web part, WPQ1. So I'm going to look for placeholder search area in my master page. There is placeholder search area. What am I going to do with it? Visible equals to false. Okay. Deployed again. Now, it's not like I don't have any work to do, right? I have to do a little bit of work, but it's not that difficult. Once you add the basic artifacts, your CSS, your images, once you add your master page, you start turning off SharePoint things and turning on your things. Now, what if I wanted to have the SharePoint search box there? Or what if I wanted to have it somewhere else on my page? Well, then I could reuse that control, right? Because maybe when the site wasn't designed, we didn't intend to have search, and now we want to add search. That's great. I can always add it back in, and especially if I just do a visible equals false and not trying to get rid of it, it will be easier. The idea with SharePoint is you have to play well with SharePoint, right? SharePoint expects lots of placeholders to be there. SharePoint is going to inject its CSS. SharePoint is going to inject its script no matter what you do. That's kind of weird looking still. But as long as you can work with it without banging your head against the wall too much, you're going to be much happier. Now, what's happening here? Why am I getting this scroll here? Well, in the regular SharePoint site, and we can see this over here in the web admin here, what they try to do is they try to have the ribbon here, and then they try to make the body scrollable. And the fact that I've hidden the ribbon doesn't mean that I haven't gotten rid of all of the CSS that's built into SharePoint. All the SharePoint CSS is still being applied, right? So again, if I go to F12, whoops, that's not where I meant to go. F12, right? And I do this. I can go down here to the body. And if I poke around long enough, what I'm going to find is that SharePoint is essentially making it so that the body can't scroll. Okay. Another really cool thing, I actually haven't shown you this yet, but it's a really cool feature of the designer. The F12 tools here. For example, if I go to the body tag, and I want to do something like, say, I don't know, I don't want to do overflow equals to hidden, for example. I can uncheck that, and it'll actually change the web page right then. I could go here and go to, notice that now I can scroll, right? Takes a second sometimes. I go here to attributes, and I can actually add an attribute, and I could add, background color. Okay. It's going to take a second, but in a second, the background will turn orange. So it's sort of, you can interactively debug with the HTML inside of the F12 tools. You can interactively debug with the CSS in the F12 tools, and you can interactively debug with the JavaScript. This is all a blank screen now, so I'm worried that I'm running out of memory or something on my machine. But if we go back to the, if we go back here, there's layout, style. Notice that I can see what are all the styles that are getting applied to this particular element, and what CSS selector is being applied, and from what CSS file. So this is what's going to allow me to go through and to say, hey, I can go through and figure out why is this particular piece of the page not displaying correctly. I can see the CSS is being applied, I can find out what the selector is, and I can go in and I can override that selector. For example, on the body, let me just go over to my sort of completed here. On my body, I actually want to go in and do a couple things. First is to get rid of the overflow hidden, right? So I go up here. Right? So get rid of that overflow hidden so I don't have that problem with not being able to scroll. And there was a couple of other CSS things that I know I needed to do. For example, on the body workspace, I needed to also set the X and Y to be overflow X auto and overflow Y auto. I'm putting these in the page. I could put them inside of my style sheet. But the main thing is I need to make sure that these selectors appear after the core SharePoint selectors. These repeat the core SharePoint selectors. And what I'm doing is I'm telling the browser, hey, whatever that selector was, whatever those properties were, here's the selector again. I'm overriding those properties. So whatever the overflow X, overflow Y setting was before, it will be this now. And I'm winning in terms of CSS because my CSS definition is closer to the element than their CSS definition. That's the first rule of CSS. CSS can get a lot more complicated. There are more complicated rules, fun stuff that you can do. But the basic idea is I can change CSS properties of earlier selectors by adding a selector that's closer to the element than the other selector, and I can override it. Okay? Let's go over here and refresh and see if we're looking better. Hopefully it'll look a little better. So, yeah, it looks a lot better. This is the idea, is that I'm going to keep kind of doing this iteratively. In some ways, it is sort of a hunt and peck. I'm going to have to poke around and figure out, why is my HTML doesn't look the same as the other HTML, and using those F12 developer tools is just huge, right? Huge in terms of being able to look at a design. You've added something in the design, all of a sudden the layout gets all askew. Why is it all askew? What can you do to fix it? Rather than having to go back to the web page and save it, the master page, and save it over and save it over and save it over, you can save yourself a lot of time by doing it interactively inside of Internet Explorer. And then once you've determined, oh yeah, this is the style that I need to override, let's go back and actually put it in the master page or put it into my CSS. Okay? So step 1, create your site. Step 2, add your master page. Step 3, from the starter master page. Step 3, start moving your content in and moving SharePoint content out. Content that you don't need, the typical way to do that is by setting visible equals to false. Right? That's the best way because, again, you may need those elements at some point for certain scenarios. If you've just taken them out all completely, you're going to have trouble. The ribbon you're going to need when you want to edit. I have changed it so that the ribbon only shows up when I'm explicitly in edit mode. Right? So that's why the ribbon's not displaying on this page. Okay. Navigation. Navigation is another big thing. I mentioned buckets, right? In this case, I've got a couple of buckets. I've got home, I've got about, I've got one called booking. I want another one called holidays. In SharePoint navigation, typically those top-level buckets are subsites of your top-level site, not individual pages. Now, you can do pages, and you can do a mix of pages and subsites, but for the cleanest separation in a WCM site, it's best for those top-level, quote-unquote, buckets, as I call them, for those to be sites. This is another thing that you can automate, right? So on the slides, which you'll be able to download, and in my code, here's a very simple PowerShell script that says, hey, from a particular top-level site, create a bunch of subsites. So I'll say, create subsites. Here's my top-level site. Actually, PowerShell wants the one tick, right? And then here are the subsites I want. I want about, I want booking, I want holidays. Okay. If I wanted 10, I could put in an array of 10, values, right? So again, in terms of being able to recreate my scenario, I'd probably want to save this, as some sort of a PowerShell script, commandlet or something. But this is automatically going and creating those subsites for me so that I can take advantage of the built-in navigation, right? Because in my master page, if we go back and look, right, in my master page, the navigation was, essentially hard-coded, right? I hard-coded, because that's the way it was in the HTML, the, list right here, right? So I could replace this with, remember I left the, let me find it, sitemap data source. I left the sitemap data source in, and there was the SharePoint ASP.NET menu. I'm actually going to take that out of that area, and I'm going to go put it down. There's my footer. I'm going to put it down here, and I say visible equals to true, right? So I've got my subsites created, right, about booking in holidays. I've replaced my static navigation with the SharePoint navigation. Now, what if the SharePoint navigation doesn't look right? I can use any navigation control in ASP.NET. I can build my own. Maybe I build my own custom navigation provider too. If I have a very complicated set of sites, I might need that. But you want to try as much as possible to reuse as much of the SharePoint infrastructure as you can, because that's the whole point, right? You're building on this infrastructure. You don't want to just completely leave the infrastructure behind, right? So I'm going to use the built-in navigation. Ooh, unexpected error has occurred. It may be that it doesn't like the sitemap. DS. It may not like it being so far away. Because, of course, when it's so far away, it has a different name, right? Because it's nested. Let's try that. Error. I like how that's staring me right there. Okay, so navigation, right? Navigation in SharePoint WCM sites typically based upon subsites. So you're going to want to create a subsite for each of your major buckets. Now my layout is all messed up. Let's look at the after. That's why we have the after, right? Exactly. And voila. Let's see. I do have it. If you look over here, I do have it exactly as I described, which is right before I came down in the speaker room, I deployed all this stuff to this site. It's a different port than the one we were just looking at. But, just to show you that, wow, you suck. Let's try to deploy. What's the point of having the Julia Childs come out of the oven if it's burnt? Let's hope that that's not all. My guess is that something's messed up with the master page. Wow. Well, here's another way to deal with it. Let's go over here. Point this at the new site. And do deploy there. Ha-ha. Yeah, that's all wrong. Yeah, something's messed up over there. So let's see the after. Deploy succeeded. All right, so let's see if that works. So this has all so far been about the master page and navigation. Oh, hey, cool. So here is, booking, right? Here is about, right? Notice that the URLs all reflect, the navigation buckets of the subsites, okay? Another question that we often get when we're talking to people about web content management in SharePoint is, can I get rid of the /pages and the /default.aspx? And the answer is no, can't. That's the content management system. Every content management system has some, URI scheme set up. That happens to be SharePoint's scheme. And people say, well, then the search engines won't like my pages, et cetera, et cetera. That has no effect on your search engine ranking at all. Right? The URL of your site, in terms of having a .aspx or having multiple path segments, doesn't affect your ranking at all. Your title and the H1s that are on your page affect your site ranking much more than the fact that you have ASPX, right? Google and Bing, right? They're smart enough to know that people use Java to build websites, people use ASP.NET to build websites. They don't care what the ending is. Some people have sort of a not a semantic problem, but they just don't like it. It doesn't look clean. It doesn't look pretty. Yeah, who cares, right? It doesn't matter. Okay, content. We haven't even gotten into the content area yet. So how do we add the content? Well, the way we add the content is inside of our web application, we're going to go and create a definition. The definition we're going to create is something called a content type. I'm going to go to settings, layouts, .aspx. Content types. Oh, I see. The whole Julia Childs thing turned me around. Doesn't the browser know that I really want that? Oh, boom. Wow. Oh, cool. Maybe that's why there was an error. Set to teens. Haha, cool. All right. So I'm going to create a site content type. What are content types and why do we care? SharePoint is a system that's built on top of a database. And they have their own database schema. When you want to store data inside of SharePoint, they don't extend their schema. That is, if I say I want to store this piece of data, they don't create a new table for your data. They have a generic table layout in which inside of that they store your data. And they store that in what's called a list. Right? So a list is a definition of a table, essentially, in SharePoint. And we put rows into a list, and that's our data that's inside of SharePoint. Content types are those definitions. So if you're not familiar to SharePoint, content types are sort of similar to table definitions inside of SQL. Right? They don't translate directly to table definitions, but they're sort of analogous. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a site content type, and that content type I'm going to call it homepage. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to derive it from the page-based content type. So all content types have structural inheritance. I'm going to structurally inherit from the page content type, which is a special content type inside of the publishing system. I'm just going to put it in an existing group to save a little time. And I'm going to go ahead and add some columns. So I'm going to add some new columns to this page. Remember my web page had sort of two images in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I'm going to add a column called header image. And it's going to be an image with formatting and constraint for publishing. And I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And then I'm going to add another new site column. And I'm going to call this main image. And this is also going to be an image with formatting constraints for publishing. And I'm going to press OK. All right, so now I have this content type that's a page content type. And the special thing about page content types is that they can have page layouts associated with them. So what I can do now is if I go over to SharePoint Designer, I can go to Page Layouts. I can say New Page Layout. I'm going to base it upon a particular content type, right? So I'm going to base it upon my content type. This is going to be home. And I get an ASPX page. What I can put in that ASPX page is any HTML, just like a regular ASP.NET template. I can also put web parts, if I want to add web parts. The most important thing I'm going to add to this page, however, is what's called a field control. A field control, and if I scroll down in the toolbox to the bottom, I can see that here are my content fields that were added based upon the content type that I just created. So basically, SharePoint knows about this whole system and says, oh, you created a content type. What are your fields? We have ASP.NET controls that know how to render those fields. Most importantly, not just render them, but allow them to be edited, right? So the field control system in SharePoint is not just about display for the end user, it's also about display and editing for the person who's creating these pages. The whole point here is to create a system where somebody can go in and create a page or change an image on the home page without having to ask a developer to go change something, right? And SharePoint has this whole system set up. So let's go ahead and add the main image in the main content placeholder. Again, this is just ASP.NET master page, ASP.NET page. Inside of my master page, I had added a, I don't know why it's showing the old master page. That's sort of annoying. But, you know, SharePoint Designer is sort of annoying. I'm sure Ted would agree to that even if he says that he loves it.
Go ahead and speak for me, John.
Never stopped me before. So let's go ahead and put in the header image here. This is not exactly the page layout that I want, but it'll be close enough, and we only have a few minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now I need to add a new page. So I'm going to go back to the website. I'm going to go to Site Actions, More Options. This is going to bring up a list of things that I can add to the page. So that was my hat as the developer that was building the content types and the layouts. Now the hat I have on is Web Content Creator. I'm going to go in and create a new page. I'm going to pick Publishing Page and Create. I'm going to pick from my list, I'm going to call this Index. Over here, I'm going to pick from the list of page layouts. This is the page layout that I just added that's associated with my home page content type. So now I can say new one of these and create. And that's going to bring me to be able to create the page. In this case, what it's going to let me do is insert a picture from SharePoint. Right? So I'm going to go and browse and find the image that's supposed to go there. Right? Style library. Blue Yonder. That wasn't my fault, by the way, just to be clear. What do we have? Temp header, right? So this is where, I'm the content creator, and I'm going in, and I'm going to be able to add the images that I want to display on the home page. And the idea here is that, of course, the content creator can come back, a month later and say, no, I want to change the image. All they have to do is go to edit mode on the page, change the image, point it to the new place. The image, this editor, right, this is the field control editor, allows me to go browse for the image that I want, set the properties on it, change layout if I want to, et cetera, et cetera. And that whole system I showed you of field controls in terms of the rendering for both runtime and editing time is also extensible. So you can build your own field controls that plug into that system if you want to give your users a different editing experience or a particular editing experience. Okay. So, at the end, you're going to have a page, and that page is going to have the content of the base inside of your page layouts. It's going to fit inside of your master page, and, basically you have, a highly designed SharePoint site, right? Okay. So I think I'm done. Anybody have any questions? If you have a question, it's better if you go up to the microphone, but if the microphone's far away, I'll repeat your question. I think I have 2 minutes, right? Am I right? No questions? One question over here. Yes, sir.
CSS tags you add to the master page, if you mistakenly have the wrong after tag, will it cause the page to break?
So the question is, if I put the CSS tags in the wrong order, which in the case of SharePoint is using the after attribute, will that break my page? And the answer is it depends, but probably yes. I mean, especially if you're using CSS to change some setting that's coming down from core v4.css, yes, likely your page will break. The nice thing about IE is when you go look at the CSS if you go look at the developer tools, when you go to the CSS tab, it'll actually show you the CSS and what order they were added. So it's pretty easy to figure out, oh, look, my blueyonder.css is loaded before core v4.css. That must be why I can't scroll in the page, right? So it's pretty easy to figure out. Any other questions? Yes, sir. That's a great question. The question is, if I get rid of the ribbon, how do I get into edit mode? Well, notice I'm in edit mode here. This is actually another part of the demo, which is, sometimes weird stuff happens, like you have multiple developers working on this. Somebody didn't like the ribbon. And it's supposed to be displaying, but it's not. If I go find the ribbon here in the HTML, find the ribbon. Notice down here, in layout.css, some developer put body S4 ribbon row display none. So it's supposed to be displaying here, but it's not, and that's because somebody added that CSS. So that's just another example of how you can override CSS from the core, and also how the F12 tools can really help you with debugging. That doesn't actually answer your question, although it shows that my ribbon is showing when I'm in edit mode. So if you have an already existing page, it's very easy. I mean, the query string to get into edit mode, if you have the right rights, is control mode equals edit and display mode equals design. So that's one way. Another way is if you go into SharePoint Designer and you go to List and Library, you go to the Pages library. I'm sorry, I want to go down here to All Files. Go to All Files, Pages. It's going to show you the pages that are in the library. If I right-click and I say Edit File in Advanced Mode, SharePoint Designer says, you can't do this because this is not a file that's editable in SharePoint Designer. Would you like to edit it in the browser? And if I say, yes, edit in the browser, it's going to bring it up in the browser and bring it up into display mode. And I'm getting 4 not found. I don't know why. Let's try this one. Edit in browser. Why can't I what? Edit it there? The reason you can't edit it there is that the page is a combination of the data that's in the pages library and the layout. So there's no editing of lists in SharePoint Designer. I mean, essentially when you look at this, if you want to, you can actually go down to the level of saying, I'm going to look at the layout settings. And if I do view all site content, I'm going to see the pages library. And if I look at the pages library is just like any other list, right? And I can go in and say, hey, I'd like to, edit these properties. And it'll bring up the regular sort of list editing experience versus the editing inside of the page layout experience, right? So there's almost 2 editing experiences for pages in 2010, but the basic reason is SharePoint Designer doesn't understand entering data into lists. That's the main reason. One more question, and then I'll have to clear out for the next session, but I'll go outside and answer more questions. Thank you very much. Please do your evaluation. Evaluations are extremely important to us, so, and I think you win something, right, if you evaluate enough sessions or something. So there's incentive, so thank you very much.